Hi, thank you for joining today. I'm so happy that we get to see such lovely faces here. Um, my name is Molly, and I am a bereavement social worker from Hudson Valley Hospice. And I am here today to talk with you about anticipating and coping with grief and loss. Before I move forward, is everyone able to hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Great. So, like I said, it's a privilege to welcome you all to today's presentation on anticipating and coping with grief and loss. Whether you're a caregiver, a family member, or someone who has personally walked beside a loved one, your presence here today reflects compassion, courage, and a shared commitment to understanding one of life's most profound transitions. Grief is something that touches every one of us and often comes in many different layers. It can involve the loss of friends, independence, health, or even a familiar way of life. And for those who care for our loved ones, anticipating these changes can be both painful and deeply meaningful. Today's discussion is about more than loss. It's about preparation, connection, and resilience. So we'll explore ways you can support yourself and others as you navigate the different emotions and landscapes that you're going to come across, and how we too can find strength and empathy and grace in this process. By the end of this presentation, we hope you'll walk away not only with practical tools and insights, but also with a renewed sense of hope. The understanding that grief, while deeply human, can also open doors to healing, remembrance, and love. Thank you all for being here, for your openness, and for your willingness to engage in such an important and sensitive conversation. So let's begin this journey together, and I'll walk you through our first slide that we have here. We're going to talk a little bit more about what grief and what mourning might look like and might mean. I like to start off by this first quote that we have here. Grief is the normal response of sorrow, heartache, and confusion that comes from losing someone or something important to you. And the grief that we feel is a passive experience involving a variety of reactions to the perception of loss, and it's necessary for us to accommodate a loss. Versus mourning. Mourning is an active response to loss involving conscious and unconscious thoughts that challenge our assumptions about ourselves and the world around us created by that loss. So when we talk about grief, we're talking a lot about the emotional aspect of things, that process of losing your loved one, while as mourning is the action, what you're doing in response to the loss of that person or the grief that you are feeling. There are many different things that might influence or impact somebody's grief and their healing process. A lot of times, your connection to your loved one, right? Your relationship with them. Are they your friend? Are they your spouse? Are they your child? Are they your sibling? And also, gender does play a role. Sometimes the age of your loved one, if they passed away at an earlier age, that can be a very traumatic experience for some people. And also the nature of your loved one's death. Some of us have experienced loved ones who have died in very traumatic ways, and that leaves a very big impact on us and how we grieve. And there's also secondary losses. So although we lose our loved one, there are so many other things that we lose along in that process. And also your support system that you have plays a very big role in how you are going to grieve, right? If you have a good support network, you have a lot of people around that you can talk to and process things with, and have that good support. While some people don't have that, they don't have that support and they struggle a little bit with their grief because they don't have that. There's also so many other things that can contribute to your grief and how you process the loss of your loved one. But we're next going to talk about the different types of grief that you can experience. So the first type of grief we talk about is quote unquote normal grief. I do like to point out that there is no normalized or right way to grieve. When we talk about normal grief, we talk about people who are mourning their loved ones. They go through the different stages of grief. They have a good support system, and they're able to process their grief in an appropriate way. Sometimes people experience anticipatory grief. So this is the mourning process that occurs before your loved one dies. So this can be when your loved one is still living. Maybe they have dementia, something that they are mourning in the process. You're losing your loved one along the way, and you're anticipating their death and what that might look like or mean for you. Some people also experience complicated grief. Now, this is a more intense feeling of grief. Sometimes people are in a longer state of mourning. This is something that impacts your daily living, causes you, emotional distress, very heightened states of grief and sadness. And then we talk about chronic grief. So this is grief that lasts a longer amount of time. Usually we talk about, more than a year. And it's something that's really debilitating for that individual and really impacts their daily living, their daily functioning. And then some people experience delayed grief. So that can be when somebody experiences the loss of a loved one, and maybe the reality of that loss doesn't set in right away, and they find that later on in their grieving process, they have more of an intense reaction, and everything kind of comes to them later on instead of in the initial stages of their grief. And then you also have prolonged grief. So we talk a lot about this and about the different diagnoses that people can have when it comes to grief. And usually with prolonged grief, it's something that lasts longer than a year. Typically, people are in a deep state of mourning throughout that year. They don't really socialize with other people that much. It's hard for them to function. It's hard for them to do things that they were once able to do normally. And that lasts about a year or more for that individual. Next, we talk about masked grief. And this is when individuals will tend to hide their grief emotions or maybe not openly acknowledge the sadness that they feel. They tend to keep it inside. And then we have disenfranchised grief. So for disenfranchised grief, it's when the loss maybe is not openly acknowledged or something that is not openly mourned by other people, like maybe the individual died of suicide or maybe an overdose, and that complicates the grief that the individual feels. Maybe they're not openly able to grieve it the way that they want to. Next, we have traumatic grief. This happens possibly when the death was unexpected to somebody. Maybe the death was traumatic. Maybe they weren't anticipating it. Maybe the individual was young. So that's when it can become more of a traumatic grief response for people. And the next one is collective grief. Sometimes we all feel like this, right? Maybe if we have a state of emergency or maybe a tragedy that happens somewhere in our world, we all can feel the collective grief and weight and impact of that. So that's when we talk about collective grief. I know the news pretty much brings up a lot of that grief for us all. So sometimes people even talk about that can be something that causes them grief, just to see other people suffering. And then lastly, we have ambiguous loss. So this is a response to somebody who has a loved one who's still living. So that could be maybe someone who has dementia, they're not remembering who you are, they're losing their independence along the way, and you are observing that and grieving those losses along the way. So that's what we mean when we talk about ambiguous loss. Okay. So now that we've talked about a few of those different types of grief, I do want to touch base on what disenfranchised and anticipatory grief are, because a lot of us do experience that anticipatory grief, especially when you are aging and you're getting older. Your loved ones around you are getting sick. There's a lot to anticipate and grieve, especially in those positions. So the first quote that I want to touch upon is the disenfranchised grief. So, disenfranchised grief is a person's experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. So, I talked a little bit about that before in the slide where maybe somebody has a loved one who died of suicide or maybe of an overdose. That's more of the disenfranchised grief where they might not feel comfortable openly mourning or expressing their loss. Whereas anticipatory grief is the normal mourning process that occurs when your loved one is still living and you are experiencing his or her death. So that comes in many different shapes and forms to a lot of people when you're anticipating the loss of a loved one. So that's why we like to take some time and differentiate between the two of them, and let you guys know that there's so many different forms of grief and ways that people can experience that. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that disenfranchised grief that I mentioned before. So, just to become a little bit more clear, I have 5 points that I'm going to read to you. So, the loss isn't something that is seen as worthy of grief. So, non death losses, right? So, we can lose people and things that are not dying in our lives. And that's also a very big loss to us. Sometimes the relationship is stigmatized. So maybe it is an ex partner or in an extramarital affair and they lose their loved one. It's difficult for that individual to openly express and mourn their grief. The mechanism of death is stigmatized. So, like I said, sometimes suicide or an overdose. Sometimes people don't feel like they are openly can mourn that and express their grief. And then the person grieving is not recognized as a griever. So maybe it's a coworker or an ex-partner or spouse. Oftentimes they are the ones that, often do experience grief and loss and sadness, but maybe are not encouraged to express that like some other people are. And then lastly, the way someone is grieving is stigmatized. So the absence of an outward grief response or extreme grief response. So if maybe somebody is having high expressions of their emotions and grief, some people will tell them, that, you should be getting over this, right? Or maybe you're reacting a little bit, too high to the situation. So sometimes people might experience that in the way that they're stigmatized for their grieving. Some common sides of anticipatory grief. So, though this is different than the grief that follows a death, anticipatory grief can carry many of the symptoms of regular grief. So, we talk about sadness and anger, isolation, forgetfulness, and depression. Those are all signs of the same people who are also grieving the loss of their loved one after their death. So you can experience some of these same emotions before your loved one actually dies. A lot of these complicated emotions are also coupled with the exhaustion that comes with being a caregiver. So that is a very big weight for people. It takes a lot to be a caregiver. You give up, a lot of socially, emotionally, and physically of yourself to take care of your loved one. And although that means a lot and is very important, it does cause some exhaustion in people. And then awareness of the looming death of a loved one and accepting that it will come can bring an overwhelming anxiety and dread. So yeah, if you're in a state where you're anticipating your loved one is going to die and thinking about that and what that might mean or look like for you, can be very worrisome. Sometimes, that keeps people up at night worrying about their loved one and wanting them to be okay. So it's normal to have those worries, but that could also contribute, like I said, to that exhaustion part of being a caregiver. And then in advance of a death, we grieve the loss of the person's abilities and independence, their loss of cognition, a loss of hope, a loss of future dreams, a loss of stability and security, a loss of their identity, our own identity, and countless other losses. So that's what we mean when we kind of talk about those secondary losses that people can experience. Because you're not only losing your person, you're losing their independence. You're losing maybe your ability to communicate with your loved one during that time. So there's a lot of those little losses that also accompany that larger loss of your loved one. So it's important to also talk about ways to cope with anticipatory grief. So it's good to know that, you can accept that anticipatory grief is normal. Sometimes it's very isolating to care for a loved one and to go through that emotional strain. So accepting that, some of these things that you're going through are normal can be very helpful. Next, acknowledge your losses, right? Maybe it's those secondary losses that you're experiencing along the way. And connecting with others. Sometimes it's hard for us to reach out and seek support, especially maybe if it's our children. We don't want to worry them or burden them. But having a really good, strong support network and having people you can reach out to, maybe for different things, one person for emotional support, maybe someone else is able to offer you some more tangible support. But having a support network is really important. Also, remembering that anticipatory grief doesn't mean you are giving up. So you can still be there to support your loved one, but also acknowledge your needs at that time and what you might be needing as far as supports or ways to process, what you're going through. It's important to reflect on the remaining time that you have with your loved one and maybe think about some meaningful things that you would like to do with them before they pass. And then also communicate. Sometimes people are nervous to communicate with their loved ones about what death means or what death looks like to them. And also communicating for you with others. Maybe you might need some support of your own during that time, and that's normal and definitely necessary. I think you guys have some really great support here at Woodland Pond as far as the counseling and other support that you get here. So definitely communicate and reach out to other people when you need that support. A big thing is also taking care of yourself. Sometimes we get wrapped up with taking care of our loved ones and we often dismiss our own needs. So sometimes we need to take a step back and remember that we need to be in the right space. We need to be taken care of as well, especially when we're in that caregiver role. And then take advantage of your support system. Like I said before, that's really important to reach out to others. and say yes to counseling. Sometimes it might be something that you need, a place to talk about your grief, to express it. Sometimes it's good to normalize the things that you're going through and get some validation from other people. Like I said, the grieving process can feel very isolating at times. So reaching out and having that support could be very beneficial for people. And then relief is normal. Sometimes people feel guilty when they are doing things that bring them joy or happiness, and their loved one is not there to also experience that. So normalizing that, having a sense of relief and not being in that constant state of grief or worrying is normal, and it's okay. And then lastly, don't assume. Sometimes we have a lot of assumptions about grief and death and loss and what that might look like for us and for other people. So we like to normalize that the grieving process is different for everyone. So everyone may have their different way of processing things. So we like to keep that in mind. All right. So I want to read this nice little quote that I have here. Each person's grief has its own fingerprint. Every journey of sorrow has a unique map. And that's by John Mark Green. And that just kind of goes into further of everyone's unique journey with grief and loss and their feelings of sorrow and loneliness. So normalizing that it's going to be unique for every person. Okay. Another quote that I'm going to read to you that kind of touches more on the different feelings that you might experience when you are grieving. So, grief is hard work for so many different reasons. But one of those reasons is because it forces you to stretch your heart and mind to create enough space for all your thoughts, emotions, and desires to exist alongside one another. And then in the little circle, you can see all of these different emotions that are normal and sometimes necessary to feel in your grieving process. And sometimes you can go back and forth, right? So you might be going in circles, going through the longing, the helplessness, the sadness, the numb feelings, the anger, the guilt. And these can be very normal things in anyone's grieving process. Also, the importance of this quote is making room for your feelings. So acknowledging that this is, something that you're going through. This is the feeling that you're experiencing, and making room for those feelings so that you can further process them in your grief, right? If you're experiencing maybe feelings of anger or guilt, it's helpful to make some room and space for that so you can process it. Another common grief reaction is compartmentalization. So oftentimes we try to balance between all of our feelings and experiences with grief and loss, and then also trying to live your day to day and to be happy and to move forward. So compartmentalization is a delicate balance. We can put things away in a box in order to get up and go to work as a way to do our jobs, while also dealing with heavy emotions. However, we also must recognize when the time comes when we need to rest or to cry. So that goes into making some space for your feelings and your emotions and your grief. It is difficult if you try to bottle all of those emotions and experiences. Sometimes you need that space to cry, to let your emotions out, to acknowledge that you're feeling that sadness or that loneliness. And to maybe have a space to further process that. So like I said, maybe that's a support group, maybe that's a friend who you can talk to, or a counselor. So creating some space for that moments of sadness, but also finding that balance where you're able to get up and also function on a daily basis. And then we can also put things in a box with the hopes of never having to open it. This can backfire if we never allow ourselves to deal with what we have packed away. So that goes into, again, bottling up your emotions, not allowing yourself to feel or to cry or to let it out. So compartmentalization, basically just finding that balance of processing your emotions, allowing for that space, but also being able to function and live your life. Okay, so we also talk about mind and body connection. So emotional or mental reactions that are not addressed can begin to manifest as physical health problems. And there is a definite connection between physical and mental health. So we like to stress this. If you're not taking care of your mind, how you are doing emotionally, that could take a toll on your body. Maybe if you are struggling with depression and you're not taking care of yourself physically, sometimes that's how health concerns can manifest. Maybe if you're not feeling well enough to go to your doctors or to keep up with your own health, it could be very detrimental, especially in the grieving process. So making space to process your mental health, your emotions can definitely be beneficial for you and your body. Another tip that we like to give out is our first aid for difficult emotions. So this is like a little tip that we like to give out for people to take a step back. It's called AID. So the first acronym A is accept whatever you are feeling. So taking a moment to check yourself, right? If you're experiencing a really bad day, you're really sad, or you're really angry, or you're really anxious, take a moment just to acknowledge whatever that feeling you are experiencing, whether it's anger or loneliness or sadness. And then I identify your feelings. Why am I feeling angry? Why am I feeling loneliness, you know? And then D, do something. Is there any coping skills you can utilize in that moment? So maybe it's taking a walk, maybe it's calling a friend, maybe it's giving your time that yourself that space to cry and to let those emotions out. But it's really helpful for you to take action when you are acknowledging that you're experiencing a difficult grief emotion. And that looks different for everyone, right? We all have different coping skills. So sometimes it could take a little while to figure out what is beneficial for you. Sometimes people like to meditate, sometimes people like to put on a nice show to take their mind off of things. Or some people like to just connect with other people. Maybe it's going to an activity, or doing something where you're not isolating yourself. So figuring out what works for you. Give yourself permission to be right where you are in your grief journey. Okay. I also like to include this little quote here. Emotion is just energy in motion. It has to move, and don't suppress it. So that just gets back into acknowledging the significance of your emotions, the power that your emotions hold, and allowing them to flow and to sometimes leave if you need to let it out and express that. Okay, I want to spend some more time talking about those secondary losses that I mentioned before. So not only is there the loss of your person, but adjustments have to be made with respect to many aspects of life. So when we talk about that secondary loss, we're talking about all of the many other things that you might possibly lose in the process. So this little diagram over here in the middle shows your primary loss, or the person that has died. And then on the outside, these are some of the secondary losses that someone might experience. So it could be the loss of income. Maybe their partner died, and they were helping to, bring income into the household, and now it's just one income. that could be very detrimental and a loss to someone as well. Sometimes people experience a loss of identity. Maybe if you lose your partner, your spouse, it can lead you sometimes to think about who you are as an individual now that you don't have your loved one here, and what brings you meaning in life now that it's just you. Sometimes it could be a loss of dreams for the future. Oftentimes, with partner loss as well, you have plans and dreams for the future with your loved one. And then once you lose that person, you start to, um, think about what you want to do next for you in your life. So maybe it might be a change of plans or goals that you once had for yourself and your partner or your loved one. Some people even have a loss of a support system. Maybe the person that they lost was someone they went to for emotional support, or they were very, very close to that person. They told them a lot, and now they don't have that support or that connection anymore. And that can shift your whole entire support network. And then there's so many other things that you can lose along the way. Maybe it's even your home. Sometimes people have to sell their home and move, and that has a lot of meaning for people living in the home that they created with their loved one or had memories in. That's very meaningful, and sometimes people lose that as well. So that can look different for everyone, secondary losses, but it is a very big part of the grieving process that we like to acknowledge. It's also important for us to talk about grief theories. So, as you know, there are a few different types of grief models that people talk about, like the 5 stages of grief. There's also the tasks of mourning. Kubler-Ross was the one who had the models of grief, the 5 stages of grief. Then you also have Worden's tasks of mourning. And these basically helps to normalize what the grieving process might look like for somebody and some of the common emotions or experiences that people can go through while they're grieving. So we're going to be talking a little bit about some of these grief theories. A couple more on here. We talk about continuing bonds. And this is important also with grief. So you lose your loved one, but it's hard for you to also have that disconnect of the emotional attachment and relationship that you had with that person. So sometimes there are ways that we try to continue bonds. So people might continue to talk to their loved one even though they're not here, or maybe visit places that they used to go with their loved one, and that brings them comfort. So there are different ways that you can continue your bond with your loved one even though that they are not here with us. And then we talk about the dual process model. So that is kind of how people can go back and forth between different grief emotions, and adaptive grief. So people getting back to functioning and living their life even though their loved one is no longer here. We're going to talk a little bit about Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. This is a pretty big one that a lot of people know and talk about. Lists 5 different stages that people may go through. I like to, normalize that you may not go through all 5 stages, or you might go through 1 or 2 of them. It looks different for everyone, the way that they grieve. So let's talk a little bit more about the 5 stages of grief. So we talk about the 5 stages. The first stage is the denial or the shock stage, they also call it. And that is when you are first adjusting to your loved one's loss. Maybe it's difficult for you to fully acknowledge that they are gone at this point. It does take a little bit of time to process those emotions and to have the reality of your loss set in. People often experience anger. That's the second stage. So that could be anger maybe towards their loved one, towards medical professionals or care that they received, anger towards other family members. So people can experience anger a lot. and even depression. That's the third stage. So feelings of not being able to function like you normally would. Maybe you're not taking care of yourself as you used to, having difficulty getting out of bed, or maybe isolating, or really intense feelings of sadness. All those things can go into the depression that people experience. And then the fourth stage is the bargaining stage. And sometimes in that stage, people will experience feelings of guilt, maybe having thoughts of, why was it my husband instead of me? Or I would do anything to get my loved one back, having some of those thoughts. That's pretty common in the bargaining stage. And then lastly is the acceptance stage. So this takes a little bit of time for people to reach that acceptance stage. Normally you have to process and kind of grieve the denial or the anger or all of the emotional responses that you experience in order to get to the acceptance stage, where you're basically able to still honor and remember and love your loved one, but moving forward, you're able to find moments of happiness and live your life and have room to continue on and make moments that are going to be happy for you. Another thing that's important to mention is that the 5 stages of grief were never intended to apply to those grieving a loved one. So we like to normalize that grief is not linear. Sometimes you might experience all of these emotions on the 5 stages of grief, but like I said, it is normal to not go through all of the different stages all at once. So it might look different for everyone. And then every journey is unique, and there is no set point at which grief ends. Rather, grievers adjust over time and learn to live with their grief. Another grief framework that we're going to talk about is Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. So this is kind of similar to the 5 stages of grief. It's a little bit different, but it has the same framework. So the first task would be to accept the reality of your loss. So getting past that denial or that shock that you experience. Task 2 is to process the pain of your grief. So if you're experiencing any of those, emotions of sadness or loneliness or guilt or anger, that's where you're doing a lot of the processing and work. And then in the third task, adjusting to a world without your loved one. So that's where a lot of people spend most of their time, is adjusting to all of the many different changes in their role and their identity. And they are, trying to rebuild and adjust to their new normal, their new way of living. And then the last task is 4, and that is where you're able to find an enduring connection with your loved one while also embarking on a new life. So being able to love and honor your loved one, but still living and doing things that bring you joy and happiness. So finding that balance between the two. Next, we talk about the dual process model for grief. And this is normalizing that grief looks different for everyone and is not linear. So you may be bouncing back and forth between days where you're feeling good, you're in a restorative phase, right? So maybe you're creating new traditions or finding new roles in your life, or maybe doing things that make you happy. And then maybe the next day you have a really bad day where you're feeling, feelings of sadness or loneliness. So it could be like that. You could have good days. You could also have bad days. So we normalize that you might ebb and flow between, positive emotions, feeling good, but then you might also have some bad days. And holiday times also brings up a lot of reactions and sadness for a lot of people, when we think of the holidays, we think of being with our family and our loved ones. So that can also be a really difficult time where people tend to lean more towards their loss-oriented mindset, where they're feeling that sadness, where they're feeling that grief. And that's when we talk about ways that you can honor your loved one and incorporate your loved one into your celebrations. And maybe that's creating new traditions or things to keep them a part of your enjoyment for the holidays. Next, we're going to talk about growing around your grief. So this is a model created by grief counselor Lois Tonkin. So it talks about people's expectation of grief. So we feel like people experience their grief in ways that are very intense. So sometimes people picture their grief as this big ball that takes up their life, and you're in a very intense state of grief. And then slowly over time, your grief becomes smaller and becomes very small in your life. Whereas actually, with grief, if you look at it from this diagram on the bottom level, your grief stays the same size. But eventually, with life, you tend to grow and to have more room and space for love and your family and for new experiences. So you'll always have, that grief within inside of you. You'll always have a special place for your loved one, but you will learn to have more space and more room and grow to have more happy moments and people in your life. So we like to take a moment to acknowledge that grief doesn't get smaller over time. Your grief might always still be there, but you will have the coping skills, you'll have more support, and you'll have more knowledge on how to cope with those feelings of grief when they come over time. Okay. And I think it's important for us to talk about some tools and tips for navigating our grief. So it could be very helpful for you to read some books. There's a lot of podcasts out there that talk about grief and loss, and also websites that you can go to that you can learn more about grief. You can read about helpful ways to cope with your loss and your grief. We always use a good website that is not sponsored by hospice, but I use a lot. It's called whatsyourgrief.com. And it has a lot of information about grief, about how to cope with your feelings of loss and sadness. It has some good activities that could be helpful in further exploring your feelings of grief. So doing some research, if you can go online and see, what's out there, the articles about grief can be helpful and actually reassuring to what you're going through, normalizing some of your experiences. It could also be helpful to adjust self-expectations. So sometimes we all have a specific way of how we view death and grief and how we expect people to mourn during that time. So grieving is a very exhausting process, and it's different for everyone. So being aware of your body, being aware of your needs, taking care of yourself is really important, and maybe having more of an open mind to being self-compassionate to yourself while you're grieving and allowing yourself to have room for those emotions. Grief is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's important to pace yourselves and to give yourself some time. Like I said before, self-care, that's another big one. Oftentimes, if you are in just a state of grief all the time, that can be very exhausting. So you might need to take moments to take care of yourself. Maybe that's going for a walk. Maybe that's making time for you to have a nap in the middle of the day because you're so tired. or maybe taking a new class or trying to engage in a new interest or hobby. Doing those little things can be really helpful in just you taking care of yourself. You might not have the motivation to go out and to do those things right away, but sometimes if you encourage yourself to try those things, it could be helpful. You never really know how you're going to feel after you go and do those experiences. It's also important for you to find your village. So getting your supports, whether that is your friends, your family, supports here at Woodland Pond. It's important to have your village, your army of people who you can call on when you're not doing okay and when you might need a little bit of support. And then also support groups and counseling. I know you guys have a lot of resources here at Woodland Pond, so definitely utilize what you have. If you feel like you could benefit maybe from some counseling or some support groups, those are really great places to start. And it's also helpful to give you information about grief and make it a little less lonely while you're going through that process. So what happens in grief counseling? So here at Hudson Valley Hospice, we have a bereavement department, and we do offer, a space for people to talk about their grief, what they're going through, some helpful tips. Maybe it's talking about different coping skills that could be helpful for you to process your emotions. But here we talk about bereavement social workers help the grieving by providing safe spaces to explore their different grief reactions, often normalizing and validating their individual experience and timeline. Sometimes people need additional mental health support, and those connections are also encouraged during sessions. And then lastly, we do offer services here at Hudson Valley Hospice. We do individual grief counseling. So it's available to those who have a loved one who died on hospice services. But we do offer grief support groups. We have some that are offered over Zoom. And then we have some different locations in Ulster and Dutchess County where we do run support groups as well. So if you ever wanted some connections or help, you could reach out to us. If you're interested in any of our services, you can certainly give us a call. Here is our direct bereavement number. And I also wanted to mention that we do have some handouts. Jill over here, who's also in the bereavement department, we have some handouts about coping with grief, normalizing grief a little bit. And then we have some information about coping through the holidays. Like I said, the holiday times are coming up, and that could be really difficult for people, bring up a lot of different emotions and feelings. So we just have some things to help during that time. So if you would like, Jill has some over there on that side table for you to grab on your way out. But I would like to leave some time and space for you all if you have any questions for me about our bereavement department or about anything that we discussed in our slides, all the great information I shared with you guys today. So I open it up to you if there's any questions that you want to ask.
Excuse me, thank you. I just also wanted to mention that, as you all know, we have our own social worker here, Annika Epley, who is available if anybody wants to talk with her. And there are also grief groups. I believe it's full right now, but there will be ongoing. So we also have those resources here. So I wanted to make sure everybody knew that.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you.
for that. Yes, it's really important. Like I said, you have some really great resources here at Woodland Pond, so definitely utilize that. It's great that you have a point person that you can go to and get this support. So yeah, that's definitely about, grieving and coping. So I encourage you all to definitely reach out. Yeah, thank you for that.
And just to quickly clarify too, so the group is full at the moment, but we plan to have it be an ongoing group. So we'll definitely have more space in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about grief or grieving or what that looks like or feels like for them or anything that they are um, going into the holiday time having difficulty with? No. Yeah, okay, good. Good. I'm glad. And there's more information and papers too, so thank you.